It has become fashionable to say that America is not a Christian nation, that we have freedom of religion, therefore, because there's no state-mandated religion, which is what freedom of religion means, by the way, that America is not a Christian nation, and that the religion of its inhabitants has no bearing whatsoever on how successful this system will be, which, of course, as we are seeing today in nearly every aspect of our society, is complete nonsense. The only reason our system of government worked in the first place was that the inhabitants not only self-policed their behavior through the enforcement mechanism that was their belief in heaven and hell, but the very concept relies on the public having a healthy understanding of personal responsibility, or as the Christians who built this nation viewed it, receiving blessings from God when you obey his commandments and being punished for your sins when you don't. In Christianity, life itself is viewed as a meritocracy. You live on this earth, and if you obey God and you're a good person, you earn your place in heaven. If you're a bad person, you burn in hell for eternity. When eternity is involved, a lot is riding on your ability to self-govern your behavior while you're alive on this earth. It has eternal consequences. This is a uniquely Christian way of thinking. Muslims don't have the same version of heaven and hell, neither do Jews or Hindus or Buddhists, and obviously atheists worry about going to hell least of all. The Christian concept of eternal damnation was the concept that enforced the self-policing and the good behavior that made the free society developed on this continent possible. The term God-fearing Christian used to be a common term in this country, used to describe the character of good men. It described whether or not a man could be trusted. Did they fear the eternal wrath of an omnipotent God? Did that fear influence their behavior, or did they just fear getting caught by mortal men or by the state? And while you can call it fear, eternal damnation is actually a comforting concept for the men that believe it, the men of good character who believe it, because they naturally want justice to be absolute and terrifying. And as much as these good men crave this omnipotent kind of justice, justice that no one can escape, evil men hate it. They loathe it. For the men who would be occupying this version of hell and suffering these eternal flames, this is a terrifying prospect. It's no wonder that the disgusting filth in Hollywood would have a special hatred for Christianity that wouldn't extend necessarily to other religions. These other religions offer a way out. These other religions aren't telling them that they're damned for eternity. In these other versions of hell, these other religions, you still have the ability, after paying a temporary price, awful though it might be, to eventually advance on. So in a way, there's really no need to police your behavior. If you don't mind paying a temporary price later, it's like putting heaven on layaway. They aren't suffering any permanent consequences for their actions. Their soul isn't damned for eternity. And you're fooling yourself if you don't think that while that's certainly not the only reason why the people who first founded the country were self-policing, that's not a fundamental part of why they were doing it. Hollywood goes out of its way to attack and mock Christian values and takes every opportunity to offer up alternatives to the Christian view of existence and justice, especially if it alleviates people of personal responsibility. Something you'll see often in films is the idea that when it comes right down to it, none of us have free agency. We're all just leaves floating on the surface of a pond, directionless, with no power to control our destiny. This concept is especially attractive to those who hate the Christian concept of justice. They aren't responsible for any of their actions, and therefore they shouldn't suffer any consequences for them. Probably the most successful film to undermine this view of justice is the 1994 film Forrest Gump, which won Best Picture, Best Actor, Best Director, Best Writing, Best Film Editing, and Best Special Effects. And it was nominated for 7 other Oscars. This film, which made over $500 million at the box office alone, is a film that actively sought to promote this idea that we have no free will and take away any sense of responsibility people might have for how their lives or how the world has turned out. They didn't have any control over any of it. They were simply like feathers that were floating around in the wind while the world just happened to them. Life is like a box of chocolates. You never know what you're going to get. The film begins with a feather floating aimlessly in the wind. The feather is blown about and affected by things around it, but it never makes any choices, never chooses its own destiny. It just gets knocked about by forces out of its control until it lands at the feet of the protagonist, Forrest Gump. Forrest, after saying the line about life being like a box of chocolates, reinforcing the tone set by the floating feather, launches into his life story to a random woman at the bus stop. We learn straight away that Forrest is disabled physically and mentally in some way and had to wear leg braces as a child. We also learn, oddly enough, that Forrest Gump is named after one of the founders of the KKK, Nathan Bedford Forrest, and that his mother named him after Forrest because it was to remind him that, quote, sometimes people just do things that just don't make no sense. Right away, the filmmakers are hammering home again the idea that life is senseless and meaningless. We are all just feathers in the wind. Forrest lives with his mother, who, like most mothers in Hollywood films, is a single mother. In fact, Forrest Gump's father is barely even mentioned in the film. If the main theme of this film is that life is meaningless, one of the sub-stories is that fathers are completely useless. Another message of the film is that people are all the same. Something that Forrest's mother repeats to him often. It's part of this leftist fantasy that if they just treat everyone the same, no matter how different their abilities are, they will magically all succeed. For example, when his mother finds out that Forrest has an IQ of 75, she insists that he be placed in school with normal kids. She is so determined to make this happen that she sleeps with the school principal to bribe him into letting Forrest attend school. Now, if you think about this, which most people in the audience aren't going to do because they're going to be overwhelmed with this scene that immediately follows, this scene where Gump's mom is having loud sex with the principal while her disabled son is listening outside. A scene that, if they did think about, would be disturbing enough on its own. In fact, there's a lot to unpack here. Think of all the propaganda that's being transmitted simultaneously in just this short sequence. First, we have the whole idea that somehow it would be fair to Forrest, who has an IQ of 75, to be placed with children with IQs in the 90s or above. Or that it's fair to those children with the higher IQs to have their education impacted and likely held back by having Forrest in their class, all to satisfy the delusions of the single mom. A single mom who is prostituting herself and exposing her child to that prostitution in a way that amounts to child abuse that the filmmakers pass off as a joke. All of that is going on, but the audience in their stupor, sucking down sugary soda and stuffing popcorn into their mouth, is giggling at the funny sex sounds that the disabled kid is making. This is some top-tier subversion right here, and the movie's just barely getting started. Now, next, the film launches into what will become a reoccurring situation, a device that filmmakers use to bolster this idea that we're all just feathers in the wind with no free will. The real devious thing about the method in which the filmmakers go about doing this is, on its face, it looks as though by attributing remarkable and historical events to the actions of Forrest, that the filmmakers are saying, look what you can accomplish just by trying. Here is a man with severe disabilities and he's able to be a part of history. But that's not what they're saying at all. In almost all of these circumstances, Forrest is being a part of history, not through his own free will or through accomplishment or even trying. It's all dumb luck. He's just a feather that's floating about and unintentionally affecting the world around him, oblivious to his participation. The first example of one of these instances is when Forrest unintentionally inspires Elvis's dancing style. Now, this is where we get into another dark aspect of the film. In almost every reoccurring instance where Forrest is crossing paths with famous people and historical events, almost without exception, it ends with death or assassination. Not only is life like a feather in the wind or a box of chocolates, but it's fleeting. Death awaits us just around the corner. And just as there's no meaning to life, there's no meaning to death. The film glosses over any questions there might be about the historical events or the deaths that surround them and tell the audience it's all just random. There's never any intention behind anything. We now go to Gump's first day of school. There's an odd exchange between Forrest and the bus driver. Forrest says that he can't get on the bus because his mother told him not to take rides from strangers. She tells him he needs to get on the bus. So Forrest, using his limited problem-solving skills, comes up with the solution of introducing himself so that they're no longer strangers. This scene is likely forgotten by most people or just brushed off as a cute example of how Forrest's simple mind works, but think about it from the point of view of the filmmakers. Why have that scene specifically? This film was marketed to families despite the filmmakers doing everything they can to walk right up to the line of an R rating without crossing it. Surely they knew that children would be watching this scene, just as they watched the scene where Forrest was exposed to the prostitution of his mother. Child abuse reoccurs throughout the film, and isn't it interesting that a child abduction scenario was played out just before we meet the character who will later be on the receiving end of child abuse? This is where Forrest meets Jenny. Jenny and Forrest become very close. There's a montage of intimate scenes as Forrest describes her as the most beautiful thing he's ever seen. He says that aside from his mother, Jenny is the only person that ever talked to him, and this is where we begin to see a pattern emerge. Up to this point, the only positive people in Forrest's life have been women. Up to this point, every man he's encountered has been a bad influence on his life, even boys his age. Once he has this relationship established with Jenny, he's physically attacked by boys, and it takes Jenny telling him what to do before he can react. This isn't anything new. The entire movie, Forrest has begun almost every sentence with, "My mama always said this," or "Mama says that." We might all be feathers floating around in the wind with no free will, but it seems there is a force with some control. Everything, and I do mean everything, that Forrest does originates from either his mother telling him what to do or Jenny telling him what to do. Even in this scene where he has rocks hitting him in the head, thrown at him by the evil white boys, he doesn't react until the famous line, "Run, Forrest, run," to which he obeys without question. Not only does his obedience save him from the marauding evil white boys, it frees him from the leg braces that were placed on him in the beginning of the film by the foolish old man, or the patriarchy, that insisted that there was something wrong with him that needed to be fixed. By listening to the female force in his life, he has broken free from the chains, literally, placed on him by the patriarchy. Immediately after this, we learn that the only character with a father, Jenny, has a father who is a drunk that is sexually abusing her. Because of this, she goes to live with her grandma, who lives closer to Forrest, and then often comes and sneaks into Forrest's bedroom. Now, this sequence of imagery isn't by accident. You're led to believe that what you're seeing right here in this image has to be something wholesome. After all, the police just saved her from the evil, abusive father just moments ago. This scene has to be one of innocence, and, maybe it is. Or maybe it's an image of a young girl embracing a young boy in a bed less than 10 seconds after telling you that this same girl was sexually abused. It is a subtle sexualization of children, and by itself might not be that big of a deal, but a movie is a sum of its parts. We now fast forward, and Jenny and Forrest are in high school. A repeat of the iconic moment where Forrest escaped the patriarchy by listening to the female power is mimicked exactly shot for shot. This time, instead of just escaping the evil white kids who, of course, have a rebel flag on the front of their truck, Forrest is spotted by some football coaches who decide to put him on the college team. Like all the other men in Forrest's life, they have no empathy or kindness. They are simply using him and are evil white racists who get angry when, once again, Forrest drifts like a feather into another historic event, the forced desegregation of schools. And just as in the Elvis example, Governor Wallace also has a brush with death when an assassination attempt is made. Almost every historic event that Forrest finds himself involved in ends with death. Not only does this underscore the message of the film that things like death just sort of happen, but you also have to look at this the same way a large chunk of the target audience would, the baby boomers. In many ways, this is how history exists in their minds. There really were several assassinations and assassination attempts on many powerful figures, as the deep state was first beginning to really run wildly out of control. Most of us remember where we were on 9/11 and what we were doing because it was a traumatic event. But many of us aren't old enough to know what it was like to have several of these events burn into our minds. By repeatedly invoking these events in the minds of the audience who remember them clearly, the film itself is becoming a part of the trauma. The mind has a space reserved specifically for these events. That's why they're so crystal clear and easy to recall with more detail than any other event in our lives. The film is seeping into these cavities and activating these sensitive parts of the brain. For people my age and younger, we really just have 9/11, the Challenger, I guess you could say. But baby boomers, like I said, they lived through a lot of assassinations and assassination attempts. And the filmmakers are not being shy about poking that part of their brains. A bus arrives, and the first person that Forrest had been relaying his life story to leaves, or rather, floats out of his life, just as another floats in. Unfazed, he continues to tell his tale. He talks about how Jenny went to a all-girls school and how he would go visit her. Because of the way it's presented, it's impossible to know what is really happening, but Forrest thinks Jenny is being attacked in a car when she's likely just having sex with her date. He punches her date, and her date leaves angry about the situation, and Forrest and Jenny get out of the rain and go to her room. In this scene, Jenny asks Forrest if he's ever had sex, and when he says that he hasn't, she coerces him into a sexual situation that he really lacks the ability to understand. This scene, even in the 90s when this film was released, had the roles been reversed, had Jenny been a mentally disabled girl that waited patiently in the rain outside the dorm room of a fully competent Forrest to come home, and then he coerced her into a sexual situation, this would have been considered, without question, rape. Because they're both over 18, and because I don't think that both genders are the same, reversing the roles does make a difference in this situation. I don't know that I consider it rape, but it certainly comes close because Forrest clearly lacks the ability to understand what's going on. But like all the other horrific situations in this film, it's brushed off as funny. It's a joke. In fact, they make a joke about him ruining her roommate's sweater. Gump gets on the All-American football team and ends up meeting Kennedy. The filmmakers again invoke his assassination, and they make it clear that just like everything else in life, it was meaningless. Forrest even says, quote, "For no particular reason, Somebody shot that nice young president when he was riding in his car. And a few years after that, somebody shot his little brother too, only he was in a hotel kitchen. So once again, they're bringing up these historic events in the lives of a big chunk of their audience and dismissing them as meaningless. They're accessing the trauma and then patting it on the head and saying, don't worry, we're all just feathers in the wind. We have no free will. Nothing matters, even if you're a powerful man like these men. Forrest graduates college by playing football and decides to join the army. There's a shot-for-shot mimicking of the bus scene from when he was a child meeting Jenny on the bus, only this time he meets Bubba. Now, Bubba's obviously not a woman who's going to save Gump from the evil white patriarchy, but he does represent another victim class. He comes from generations of slaves, and much like Forrest, he's a feather floating in the wind that got drafted to go fight in Vietnam. Bubba seems to have an IQ very close to Forrest, and they hit it off. Because Gump doesn't think for himself and just follows orders, he's the model soldier. Forrest also finds out that Jenny has been kicked out of college for posing in Playboy and is now working as a stripper. Now, because of his limited faculties, he thinks she's actually living out her dream as a singer. So he goes to see her, and when the crowd gets rowdy, Forrest swoops in and plays the white knight like the good beta that he is, and only, of course, like all betas, to be repaid by being left alone at the side of the road while Jenny hitches a ride with some random guy. But not before giving Gump his instructions to follow that he must run if he ever runs into trouble in Vietnam. So Forrest goes to Vietnam and meets Lieutenant Dan. Forrest keeps doing what he's told, and every single day he writes a letter to Jenny as they patrol through the jungle. Bubba tells Forrest that they should work together on a shrimping boat once the war is over, and like every other time someone tells him to do something, he agrees. But unfortunately, they get ambushed while they're out on patrol. Forrest manages to save some of his platoon while taking a bullet in the ass, but Bubba is mortally wounded and dies after Forrest tries to save him. Next, we see him at the hospital, and Lieutenant Dan has lost his legs. We discover that all the letters Forrest had sent to Jenny were sent back. She's all he thinks about, and despite their history, Jenny likely doesn't think about him at all. Forrest is now told to play ping pong by a man at the hospital, and just like that, like a man with no will of his own, he begins to play ping pong like a machine. He also gets awarded the Medal of Honor and meets President Johnson, who is one of the only historical figures that we'll encounter where something horrific doesn't happen to them afterwards. After meeting the president, he does a tour of the Capitol. He encounters some protesters that mistake him for a speaker and bring him to the podium at the Lincoln Memorial. When it comes to Gump's time to speak, the PA system is sabotaged by a military officer, and we're unable to hear anything that Forrest is about to say about Vietnam. Now, this could be viewed as the filmmakers deciding not to address a subject that to this day remains controversial, especially with baby boomers, which is a large chunk of their audience. This was a big budget film, and ticket sales could be massively impacted if they went the wrong way, said the wrong thing on something as touchy as this. And while I think this probably had a lot to do with why they decided to kind of avoid it, I also think that it goes along with the greater theme of the film. It doesn't really matter what Forrest thought. Like everything else, Vietnam is just meaningless. It would also create a situation where Forrest would have to have an original thought instead of just reacting to everyone around him, something that got him in this situation in the first place. So there's a lot of reasons for the filmmakers to kind of avoid having him speak. After he's done speaking, the PA system is fixed, and the people immediately around him who were in earshot and could hear what he was saying, unlike the audience, they all react positively to whatever the audience was unable to hear and give his name to the crowd. And that's when Jenny, who was apparently in the crowd, runs into the reflecting pool, and they meet in the reflection of the tip of the Washington Monument. And I'm not going to get hung up on symbolism here, but it's an interesting thing to notice. Jenny, it seems, has turned into a complete hippie and has a douchey communist boyfriend now. She takes Forrest to a Black Panther party, and after her soy boy revolutionary boyfriend slaps her around a little bit, Forrest completely loses control and reacts just like he did earlier in the film in the parking lot and at the strip club, and turns into the white knight for Jenny. They get kicked out of the party and spend the night talking and walking around DC. Gump learns that she is basically a degenerate hippie now, but doesn't really have the mental capacity to really understand what she's saying. He's been mildly successful and wants to create a stable environment for Jenny and take care of her, but rather than choose the safe, reliable, boring Forrest, Jenny decides to go back with the exciting, woman-beating communist. Forrest becomes a ping-pong fanatic, and time passes. We see the moon landing. Forrest meets John Lennon, who, like many of the historical figures he meets, is assassinated for, as Forrest puts it, no particular reason at all. You see, there's no reason behind anything. We're all just feathers in the wind. Forrest bumps into Lieutenant Dan in New York, who is now in a wheelchair and hasn't exactly adapted well to his new disabled existence. He spends most of his time getting drunk and hooking up with prostitutes. They hang out for a while, and Lieutenant Dan asks Forrest if he's found Jesus yet, and complains that all the disabled vets at the VA, all they talk about is Jesus this and Jesus that, and proclaims that it's all just a lie. They spend the rest of his time off together, and then Forrest goes back to ping-ponging for the Army. This time, he meets Nixon, and they make a joke about Forrest being the one that calls security on the people breaking into the DNC headquarters at the Watergate. After getting some money he got paid for endorsing some ping-pong paddles, Forrest buys a shrimp boat and tries to make good on the deal that he made with Bubba about starting a shrimping company. And like the eternal beta that he is, he names his boat Jenny, while Jenny's out doing coke at a disco somewhere. The film flips back and forth between Forrest on his boat, unable to catch any shrimp, and Jenny's life slowly disintegrating as she just becomes this drug-addicted whore and tries to commit suicide but chickens out. But then we go back to Forrest, and Lieutenant Dan has decided to join Forrest in his unsuccessful quest to find shrimp. After they spend some time trying and failing to get shrimp, Forrest and Lieutenant Dan get caught up in a storm. Lieutenant Dan stays up in the crow's nest and yells at God. Now, I want to point out a very important detail in this scene. The way this scene is presented and probably understood by a lot of people is that this is where Lieutenant Dan finds God. But this is the opposite of the truth. He isn't finding God. He's defeating God. He's openly taunting and challenging God. This scene isn't a moment where Lieutenant Dan sees the light and comes to humble himself before God. This is a showdown between Lieutenant Dan and God. This is the big turning point in Lieutenant Dan's life, and in many ways for Forrest too. But it's not what people think. Lieutenant Dan challenges God to a showdown and comes out on top. And now that he's defeated God, because he had no fear of God, he was not God-fearing, all of their wildest dreams come true. They are the only shrimping boat that survived the wrath of God, and now they have become a shrimping monopoly. And when you understand this, it's hard to take the Southern black gospel music that's playing in the background as anything other than mockery. After yet another assassination attempt, this one on President Ford, there's a brief pause in the celebration as Gump's mother dies, but it's just a bittersweet moment that seems to simply signify that he's now a man. He still doesn't have free will. I mean, he doesn't even run his own business. Lieutenant Dan, the man who defeated God, runs the business. In fact, he invests all of Forrest's money into Apple. the money starts to really flow, and Forrest decides to go live in his childhood home. And of course, now that Forrest is a multimillionaire, guess who shows up? That's right. So Jenny comes to live with Forrest. She lives off him for a while, and they seem to be getting along great, but then Forrest makes the classic beta mistake, and he professes his love and asks Jenny to marry him. Which, by the way, is one of the first things he ever does without being told to do something. One of the first things he does on his own. And Jenny, of course, rejects him. And then, feeling bad about hurting his feelings, she sneaks into his room that night, just like she used to as a child, and has pity sex with him before leaving without saying a word or even leaving a note, just sneaking off early in the morning. She's a selfish, pleasure-seeking whore who, sure, she's willing to listen to Forrest prattle on about shrimp and his mama in trade for a safe home and free living, but she will not be married to this simple man. She has standards. The one time he decided to act on his own, it ends in disaster. So what does he do? He decides to go back to what Jenny had told him to do. He decides to follow orders again and just run. So he runs for miles and miles and miles. He runs from coast to coast over and over with no reason or goal in mind. He's simply mindlessly obeying the woman that rejected him for years. He keeps running until one day he's so exhausted from years of running, he decides to go back home. Once he's home, we see another historical event to give us kind of a sense of what year it is. And of course, it's yet another assassination attempt. This time, it's the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan. And while that's playing on the television, Forrest gets a letter from Jenny asking him to come see her. And that is why he's been sitting on this bus bench. So now that we know the entire backstory, Forrest goes to meet his Jenny. After not seeing her since years ago that night, she had pity sex with him and then ditched him in the morning. And that's when he discovers that he has a son that she didn't bother to tell him about. At no point in this film do the filmmakers paint Jenny in a bad light for basically being a horrible person, using Forrest when it was convenient and then leaving him, raising his kid and not telling him that his son even existed. In fact, we find out the only reason she's telling him now is that she's dying of AIDS from being a whore. And once again, she needs his resources to raise the kid she never told him about. But then, why would she be responsible for any of this? She too, after all, must be just a feather floating in the wind. So she never really had any free will herself, and therefore shouldn't face any consequences for her actions. Look at the great lengths the filmmakers had to go to get the audience to completely accept Jenny as an angelic person. For 2 hours, the film has been building up to this moment, a moment where you're presented with a situation that is in no way morally ambiguous. Jenny is a whore that used Forrest when it was convenient, used his love and used his virtues against him for her own benefit, and then inserts herself back into his life just in time for her to die of AIDS so he can take care of the kid that she might not have ever told him about if she hadn't gotten sick. She even cruelly lets Forrest have a sham wedding with her. What a prize. A single mother drug addict with AIDS. But the audience thinks this is the greatest moment of their lives. He finally gets to have a drug addict single mom with AIDS for a few months before she dies of AIDS. And then he gets to raise her kid. Something he might not even be mentally capable of doing. And so, now that we've come full circle, Forrest drops his kid off at the bus stop, where he himself took the bus to school. And the feather from the beginning of the film slips out of his book. Once again, it's lifted up by the wind, and it floats away with no free will, no responsibility, and no consequences. The audience is trying not to cry. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how you expertly undermine a society. For BlackPilled, I'm Devin Stack. If you like my videos, make sure you like and subscribe. Make sure you share, especially now because YouTube is going to be censoring any video that is not of the approved narrative. You can help me out a lot by picking up a copy of my book, Day of the Rope. Link is in the description. Or you can donate at patreon.com/BlackPilled or subscribestar.com/BlackPilled or to the crypto addresses below.